I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining to listen to our presentation today. We're very excited about all the work that our celiac disease multidisciplinary clinic has been doing over the last year, and we're just thrilled that you're here to learn some more. So to start out, we'll just quickly go through the learning objectives. So you can go to the next slide. So first, the pros and cons of serology, genetic markers, and duodenal biopsies and diagnosis, which Dr. Kerzner will speak to. And then we're going to talk about understanding and overcoming the barriers to successful management of the gluten-free diet and review some of the educational resources that are available to patients through our Children's National Program. So we can go next.
Okay, so let me pick this up. We're talking about fake news, which of course is in the news all the time now, and we want to distinguish what's fake and what's real. And we have had myths in the past that have been replaced by some modern time myths. The first from the past, which I'm going to address, is the idea that celiac pathology is confined to the intestine. The second is that it's a rare disease outside of Europe. And, you know, we're now living with a notion that screening has pretty well been perfected. Next. Can somebody, there we are. And that we rarely need intestinal biopsies, and I'll concentrate my talk mainly around there. Next slide. So these things are really on the fake side. Next. Let's deal with the fact that celiac disease was thought to be confined to the intestine. What you're seeing in front of you is the typical picture of celiac disease years back. And indeed, this marasmic picture is a result of intestinal malabsorption. But we've come to realize that the immune system affected here has an impact way beyond that. Next slide. And this sort of iceberg diagram has been developed where that classic picture is above the sea level, and below we have atypical cases, and below that silent asymptomatic cases, and then a large population that has the potential to develop celiac disease. Next slide. The presentations can be very varied. Here we have the skin manifestations that you might see rarely. Next. You know, the child might present with tooth evidences that are seen over here. Next slide. And very importantly, and we see this far more frequently than I'd ever expected to, is osteopenia. Particularly important in the young child, to the point that fractures can occur. A point I want to make to you here is that many children with diabetes have been diagnosed with celiac disease, and one often wonders, should you then add to that burden a gluten-free diet? And one reason one does is that those children on examination do have osteopenia, and it improves in the first year of life if they're on the gluten-free diet. Moreover, if you leave the osteopenia till later years in life, it is much harder to repair. Realizing that this is a multidimensional disease, next slide. Next slide, please. Hello?
Sorry, it's showing up on mine, but apparently not yours.
I'm not here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, but the slides have come to a standstill.
Okay, they're moving on my screen. Hold on one second. Let me try again. Close out of the... Can you see the slide?
I'm not seeing the next slide.
I understand. We're trying to troubleshoot this. The slides are changing on my screen. Hold on one second, and we'll try to fix this.
Sure. Oh,
Okay.
starting over again?
Yep, we're good.
Okay.
Keep going.
Sorry, not sure what happened. It just stopped.
One more.
Connecting. There you
Okay.
go, right?
Right. Stop right there. Thank
Sorry
you.
about that.
So realizing that this is a disease that has multiple components, we now have developed a multidisciplinary approach and have a clinic that looks at it more broadly. And prior to the clinic, we send out a survey, and these are the symptoms that have been reported to us. Of 56 cases aged 2 to 17, biopsy proven in the main. Comorbidities include vitamin deficiencies, bone pathology, thyroid disease, diabetes, anemia. But if you look on the right, the reported symptoms are actually really remarkable. The gastrointestinal ones are there: vomiting, distension, constipation, diarrhea. But below that, notice 40% have headaches, fatigue in 50% almost, cognitive, learning, and attention problems in 50%. So, next slide. We have a multidisciplinary team in which, by the way, the red people are not in the picture. That's why they're in red here. We have coordinators. Blair Raber, second from the left, initiated this activity. I'm there. Vanessa Weisbrod, who'll be speaking to you just now. But we also have Shana Coburn on the far left, who's a psychologist. And we have, very importantly, Ilana Khan, a neurologist. So we have all of these components coming together at the same clinic. It's a long clinic. It takes 3 hours. But I believe this is the only way in which we're getting all of these components attacked. And it's clear from the literature that a multidisciplinary approach is far more effective in assuring long-term gluten-free diets. Next slide. Now, we know that we need to screen a large number of people to find all of these illnesses. So we used to believe this was mainly a non-European issue. I mean, a European issue, not seen in non-European countries. Next slide. And if you saw a map of the world and I asked you, where are you likely to see most of the celiacs, you'd probably look somewhere up in Europe around England, maybe Ireland. But in point of fact, next slide, the highest incidence in the world is found amongst the Sahrawis in Africa, 5.6% of the population, because they have a high incidence of the appropriate genes. There's a lot of consanguinity that probably adds to it, but they've also indulged in a very high wheat intake. Next slide. But this isn't just true of North Africa. In India, the incidence is exactly the same as we have it here in America, 1%. But the problem is only 2% were being diagnosed, as opposed to 17 and 20% identified clinically in Europe and America. And we now understand that this is far more common throughout the Middle East and even in China. The frequency increases when countries tend to adopt Western gluten-rich diets. And just how this occurs or what the precipitant is still under investigation. Notice a 30-fold increase over a 35-year period in Estonia. Next slide. And why this increasing incidence? Well, the gene frequency might be the same, and yet we still see great differences, which implies that it's lifestyle issues. Some of the thoughts we've had about what sets up the celiac problem turn out not to be true, and here's one that has recently been debunked, that the early introduction of wheat before 3 months or too late beyond 7 months increases the incidence. This turns out to be another myth. Next slide. We live in an era where we're now thinking that screening might be perfect. Well, we've all agreed that using diet to try and determine whether someone has gluten sensitivity in celiac disease is a bad idea. And this diagram demonstrates that it can take many months for either the bowel to go normal or to deteriorate once you reintroduce the gluten. Next slide. And we have taken advantage of this immunogenic cascade to begin to find ways to screen. Next slide. And so here we see that if you injure the surface, you eventually will lead to the liberation of tissue transglutaminase, just shown in that corner. Sorry, can we go back? And that tissue transglutaminase sets up a cascade which ultimately leads to lymphocytes amongst the enterocytes and throws them out. Well, this cascade at every step offers opportunities for us to diagnose and ultimately treat. Next slide. We know that there are serological markers, that there are food antibodies. Deamidated anti-Gluten IgG turns out to be a very sensitive test. Of the structural proteins, it is anti-tissue transglutaminase that we use very widely as it's most sensitive, and the anti-intermesial is most specific. I think we all agree to that. And we now know that the genes are important. But let's look a little closely. Next slide. Next slide. Let's go forward. If we look at, back one. If we look at anti-tissue transglutaminase, which is so popular, it has its limitations. Transient elevations are not uncommon, especially in the presence of other autoimmune conditions. But clearly, injury to the intestine, which can release the transglutaminase, might set up a low positive false value, and it sometimes is really important to retest and make sure that it doesn't return to normal. Occasionally, we all see remarkably false positives that and they can be very high. You suspect sometimes that this is a lab error, and I've seen very different reports from very different labs, which makes it hard to be entirely dependable, and to depend entirely on the value. Correlation with biopsies exists, but it is not absolute. And of course, we all know it's unreliable in the face of low IgA levels. But more troubling is that occasionally you get a false negative even with a normal total IgA level. Moreover, tissue transglutaminase develops relatively late. So in the very young child, under 2 years of age, it's not at all reliable. Once it develops, we use it to monitor progress, but it takes substantial time to return to normal, far longer than we originally suspected. High values will definitely take up to a year in many cases, and really high values can take up to 2 years. So this is a great test, but it certainly has its limitations. Next slide. What about the genes? We all understand that you need to have the HLA, DQ2, and DQ8 genes in order to get the disease. Let's look at this a little more closely. Next slide. So if this is the general population of the United States, 40% are DQ8 and DQ2 positive. Of those, 3% only will develop the disease. So let's look at that and be sure we understand it. Finding the genes still means that only very few of those people will get the disease. Yes, they can get the disease, but they still are unlikely to get it. And when we get reports from the lab, like the one that's shown over here, which suggests that if you have DQ8, times 2, there's a 17% increase. That's 17% of 3%. And I think one must be real careful about interpreting that. It is not a 17% increased risk of getting celiac disease, as it seems to imply over here. Note that without the genes, you're very unlikely to get the disease, but even that is not impossible, because occasionally the alleles involved in those genes will express themselves in different combinations, so that there is a very small percentage of cases that actually have celiac disease and yet don't have the typical gene setup. Next slide. We are now looking at the possibility that we very rarely need to do biopsies. Oops, my screen's gone totally blank. Hello?
Our two screens look like they're still live. Hold on.
Can you still see my slides?
I can still see your slide, and then the two people on the conference nearby.
My computer's gone totally black. Just one moment. Give me a moment.
If your screen also has gone blank, you can raise your hand.
All right, I've got it back.
Yay! Great.
I'm so big one. All right.
Touch it every now and then.
All right. Apparently, I have to touch this computer every now and then. It's that kind of a computer. Okay. Well, the endoscopic findings. If you look directly into the small intestine, the normal does not necessarily look all that different from the abnormal, and sometimes the changes are very, very subtle. Next slide. So we're totally dependent on the biopsies, and our vision of the ideal biopsy comes from the days when we did suction biopsies and we got large chunks that we could lay out beautifully and orient. And on the left, you see the normal villus structure, and on the right, this very flat mucosa with deep crypts battling to create enough cells to affect absorption. That's a completed, and we'd call that a Marshall change. Next slide. Unfortunately, when we take a pinch biopsy in the way we do, and if we cut through it tangentially, you can get a very wrong impression. And here you see villi that look as though they might be short, but in fact they're normal. The cut has just been wrong. So you need a truly expert pathologist to look at these slides. Next slide. And besides which, even if it's totally flat, we need more than the flat mucosa to be sure it's celiac disease, because all of these conditions can give you an equally flat lining. Next slide. Now, in terms of, I think this is something we can all agree on and very quickly go through. The tissue transglutaminase is the most sensitive. The endomysial antibody is specific. And in young children, we want the amidated anti-Gluten IgG antibodies because the tissue transglutaminase appears rather late. Next slide. Let's put all this together then and say, what about the guidelines for the diagnosis of celiac disease? We can pretty well agree that symptomatic children with a positive anti-tissue transglutaminase IgA and adequate total IgA with positive histology has celiac disease. But in Europe, the European Society has said no histology needed if the anti-tissue transglutaminase is 10 times normal. Now, can we buy that? We'll talk about it some more. In asymptomatic children at risk, positive histology plus positive serology, and preferably with positive HLA typing is advocated. Next slide. What's the American perspective? Well, here we still seem to insist in the main on a biopsy. And I must say, not every time, but almost every time. Serology is not standardized in the USA, and results, as I've shown you before, can be inconsistent. The disease diagnosis is a lifelong commitment. Nonspecific gluten enteropathy is confounding the picture, and gluten-free diets have become excessively popular, which makes interpretation difficult at times. So the current American recommendation is anti-tissue transglutaminase IgA to screen, but it should be combined with the deamidated anti-Gluten antibody in children under 2 years of age, because it can come, the tissue transglutaminase can come on late. We do want to confirm with a biopsy, but given the difficulties in reading biopsies, some of which I've shown you, we want to make sure that we get at least 4 biopsies from the descending duodenum and 2 from the bulb. And many times, endoscopists don't give us enough material to be certain. No biopsy remains a goal for all of us. We would like to see the day when it's not necessary, and it will no doubt come, but not yet. And more recently, there's been added impetus to do biopsies. We now realize that a great many people who believe they are gluten-free, in fact, still have flat mucosae, and we need the baseline to compare them against. Moreover, there is a significant number of children who have additional pathology, most notably eosinophilic esophagitis. We have found 3 such cases in the last year where it was not suspected. And occasionally we'll find other things like H. pylori. Our next speaker, who has celiac disease, in fact, was found to have it coincidentally when her biopsy was done. Thank you. Next slide. Vanessa?
All right. So now we're going to talk about the flip side of celiac disease, managing the gluten-free diet. So popping up on the screen now are some of the fake news things that we're going to talk about, including that a strict gluten-free diet means 0 gluten, the concept that gluten-free food is healthier and can potentially help you lose weight, that it's okay for food to cost more because it's better for you, that there's gluten in many medications, that vaccines contain gluten, and that gluten-free oats aren't really gluten-free. Next slide. Again, fake news. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a strict gluten-free diet means 0 gluten. So it's possible to have a diet that contains no gluten. These are things like a naturally gluten-free diet. And this is a type of diet that's actually really good for people who have celiac disease or anybody who's just looking to maintain a healthy lifestyle. So this would be a diet that's rich in fresh fruits and vegetables, proteins, nuts, seeds, legumes, and beans. So when you're eating these natural things, that's great, and you can say that your diet is free of gluten. But then when we come to add in processed and packaged foods, this is where we run into the problem of saying that there's 0 gluten that can get into our diets. Why, you ask? Well, it all starts in the fields when we're growing these grains. Grains that are grown in fields are inevitably contaminated. Different grains are grown in very close proximity to each other. Farmers grow different grains in the same fields at different times of year. So they're in the soil, they're in the wind, it blows back and forth, and there's cross-contamination of the grains. So unless something is done to clean or sort the grains, there's always going to be grains mixed together. So then we have to find a way how to measure what's in the food when it goes and becomes processed, and then manufacturers say it's gluten-free. So the most sensitive test that's used by food manufacturers is called the Eliza Test, and it most accurately detects gluten at 20 parts per million of gluten. Now, it's important to note that this is the standard that's used globally all around the world. The standard from the World Health Organization is 20 parts per million gluten, and this was adopted after lots and lots of testing of clinical trials looking at safe thresholds for people consuming gluten and looking at the sensitivity of different tests. There are tests that are designed to detect down to 5 parts per million and 3 parts per million of gluten, but the margin of error is quite large on them, so they're not recommended for regular use. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly talk about labeling laws and how they came to be. So the FDA has a gluten-free labeling law, and it requires that if a manufacturer is to put the words gluten-free on their package, that the product must not contain wheat, rye, or barley, or any derivatives of those ingredients. And if you have questions about those, we can provide you with a list of all of those items. Or that the product has been processed to contain less than 20 parts per million of gluten. And that can be done in a number of different ways, depending on how the manufacturer chooses to do it. It can be a mechanically sorting process, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It could be a distilling process that would strip the protein away. So there's many ways to do this. Next slide. So what does 20 parts per million look like? Here we have a picture of 1 million pieces of sand, and circled down at the bottom are 20 pieces of sand. So if you think of these in food pieces, you would have 20 little pieces of food amongst 1 million. So this 20 parts per million is a very, very, very small amount. Next slide. But what does this really mean when it comes to our gluten-free diet? Okay, so when they develop these tests They looked at the sensitivity of the test and then evidence-based research from clinical trials that were led by Dr. Alessio Fasano. He published the most prominent study. And what they found was that there was just too great a margin of error in the lower test to be able to reliably detect gluten. Next slide. So what his study found is that approximately 10 milligrams a day of gluten is safe for patients with celiac disease to cause no reaction and no damage in the gut. But what's difficult about this is that you're telling patients, okay, you can have 10 milligrams a day. So what does this really look like? Next slide. So if you were to take 18 slices of gluten-free bread, all that contain 20 parts per million of gluten, that would be reaching your 10 milligrams per day. So you could eat an awful lot of gluten-free bread or gluten-free products that were tested at 20 parts per million. If you want to think of it in terms of other food items, it's about 1 pound of gluten-free items with 20 parts per million in it that would test to that 10 milligram level. Or if you're eating a wheat product or a product that contains gluten, next slide, you would only be able to have 1/8 a teaspoon of it. So it's a very, very, very minimal amount of actual gluten that you could eat per day. Next slide. Also, everything that we've talked about up to now has been about packaged products, but I want to quickly touch on what this means in a restaurant. So when a patient would go into a restaurant that had a gluten-free menu, the menu would only signify that they deem an item to be gluten-free. There is no regulation on what food a restaurant serves. However, if the restaurant were to purchase a gluten-free bread that was tested to that 20 parts per million standard, the regulation would only apply as long as the bread was in the package. Once it's opened and it's handled in the restaurant and perhaps toasted or heated up, there's nothing regulating that that bread is still gluten-free, and there's almost zero way for us to determine whether or not there's been cross-contamination. Next slide. So what do we do with all of this information? We want to make sure that our patients are working towards maintaining a strict diet and use the information of a teeny amount being okay very, very carefully. Again, we want to work towards this strict diet, but recognize that mistakes can happen and that a very tiny exposure, while it may cause short-term symptoms, it likely is not going to cause long-term complications. And something that we've seen a lot of is a development of hypervigilance. And there was a really great study that just came out from Columbia looking at how patients with hypervigilance in the gluten-free diet are really negatively affected in their quality of life. So it's really important for patients to work with a multidisciplinary team to really find a way to make their diet work for them, both for their bodies, for their minds, and just enjoying their gluten-free diet. Next slide. So gluten-free food is healthier and will help you lose weight. So the truth is that this is not true at all. The nutritional composition of products varies greatly. So when you have celiac disease, we spend a lot of time talking about why gluten is bad for us, but we rarely talk about why gluten is good in food. And the reason that gluten is so great is that it provides structure, it gives food texture, viscosity, it thickens things, and in a lot of cases it tastes good. So when we take the gluten away, we have to find a way to replace these properties in gluten-free foods. And as I hope everyone knows, there is no one-to-one replacement for the nutritional or the structural properties that gluten offers to food. So in order to replace it, manufacturers have to use a blend of different types of gluten-free ingredients to replicate the gluten. So what this does is it leads to varying nutritional compositions and, in turn, a much higher cost for raw materials. So this can be negative for patients with celiac disease because having a low nutritional intake could lead to other health complications and deficiencies. And as we'll talk about in a second, the higher cost of things can make the diet a very big burden for families. Next slide. So I'm quickly going to talk about a big study that was done at the end of last year in the UK. The researchers looked at 679 gluten-free products and about 1,000 products that were contained gluten in 10 different food categories. For all the different categories, they looked at fat, saturated fat, sugar, and salt, and they reviewed the cost per 100 grams of food that they purchased at mainstream stores and online retailers. Next slide. And what they found is that the nutritional composition was not the same across all of the categories. In fat, the majority of the categories that they looked at had a much higher percentage of high and medium fat products, and specifically for bread, the fat was double than regular products. The sugar levels varied greatly in 8 of the 10 categories. Some were much higher, like white bread, white flour, whole grain flour, and pizza bases, and there was a median sugar content that was lower, actually, in 6 of the categories, like brown bread and breakfast cereals. So it was very varied. Next slide. For the protein levels were consistently lower in most of the gluten-free products, but the researchers deemed this not necessarily significant because people tend to eat protein in lots of other ways. The salt was higher in 4 of the categories, the whole grain flour, white pasta, breakfast cereals, and crackers, and the fiber content also was very different in most of the categories. It was higher in bread products, but lower in breakfast cereals and pasta. Next slide. So I wanted to take a look at a bread product in the United States, and if you're interested, our program has a number of different comparisons, again, amongst different food categories that your patients would eat with gluten-free options. So if we can hit next, I'm going to highlight some of the different nutrient values here. So if you look at the total fat, so this is a gluten-free multi-grain bread on the left and a whole grain gluten-containing bread on the right. The total fat in the gluten-free was 3.5 grams compared to 2 in the gluten-containing. The dietary fiber in the gluten-free was less than 1 gram compared to 3 grams in the gluten-containing, so way lower in fiber. Protein in gluten-free was less than 1 gram compared to 5 in the gluten-containing, and the sodium was much higher in the gluten-free compared to the gluten-containing. So this is just one example, but you will find hundreds of them in every single food category. And the biggest problem that you'll find is that the gluten-free products are not fortified, whereas most of the gluten-containing ones are. And a lot of that is just the manufacturers trying to keep the cost as low as they can since they're already increased. Next slide. So what do we do with this information? The bottom line is that the worst nutritional values of the gluten-free products might just be inevitable because of the different composition of the flours that you're using. So what we recommend that patients do is really look carefully at the food labels before they purchase the product. You know, don't just go into the grocery store and pick up the first replacement product that you see, because it might be not that good for you and it might not meet your nutritional goals. So we recommend that everybody meets with a dietitian after diagnosis to really think through what they need to be getting in their diet and to make good choices when they're picking products. We recommend relying more heavily on a naturally gluten-free diet. These are things that are naturally gluten-free, like fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains like quinoa, dairy, and lean proteins. And then we also try and teach our patients how to make their own baked goods so that they can have control over what ingredients are used. We have 3 classes a month at Whole Foods Market, 2 in Friendship Heights and 1 in Northern Virginia, where we talk about these alternative baking options. So we talk a lot about using alternative fats in baking, like avocados, Greek yogurt, applesauce, or even olive oil in place of butter. We talk about using less sugar and how to naturally sweeten our gluten-free baked goods, and then using a lot less salt. Next slide. So I'm not going to talk in detail about this chart, but just very briefly, this is a comparison of different gluten-free alternative flours compared to the whole wheat flour that you'll see at the bottom. The arrows are pointing to brown rice, white rice, tapioca, and then corn and potato flours. And the reason I'm pointing those out is that the majority of gluten-free packaged products that you're going to see in a mainstream grocery store are used with those 5 items. And as you can see, the nutrient values for those are far inferior to what you would get in a product made with whole wheat flour. So it really is important to be looking at what the products are made with and to be making good choices when you're purchasing them. And if you want any more information about any of these topics, we have lots of resources. So what are the takeaway messages of all of this? The nutritional value of gluten-free products varies dramatically, and you should always read labels and make good decisions before purchasing a packaged product. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about what these things cost. Higher cost of products can lead to a major reduction in adherence to the diet because people can't afford to purchase the product. and it can also lead to a lot of stress and anxiety for families who are living on a budget. At a recent journal club that we did, I did a poll of all the doctors in the room of how much they thought the gluten-free pizza cost for the night. So one large gluten-free pizza cost $24 compared to what we could have gotten that pizza at a regular pizza for about $12. So for families who have multiple kids and who are trying to manage a lot of things at the same time, adding these increased costs can be a really big burden for them. Next slide. So the same study from the UK that we were talking about, they found that the majority of products were about 159% more expensive than regular products, and that for brown bread and white bread, it was more than 4 times the cost of regular breads. And this was in line with what other studies had found of between 76 and 518% increase for gluten-free products. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to show you just a brief analysis of what we found when we went to the grocery store this week. So these are the same breads that we looked at the nutritional values for. So you'll see here that the gluten-free bread, loaf of bread, this week was $6.49 for 14 ounces, compared to $4.19 for 24 ounces of the gluten-containing bread. So you're getting a whole lot more gluten-containing bread for a lot less money than you are for gluten-free. So not only does the gluten-free cost more, but you're getting way less of it. Next slide. So this is gluten-free pasta made by the same manufacturer. For 12 ounces of the gluten-free pasta, it was $2.39 versus $1.33 for 16 ounces of the gluten-containing pasta. So you're getting, again, a lot less pasta for a lot more money, and it was a 202% increase for the gluten-free pasta. So now, this is my favorite slide. These are the same exact loaf of bread. This is 12 ounces of gluten-free white sandwich bread from 3 different stores in the DC area, and this is what the cost of this bread was yesterday. And as you can see from the different stores that just popped up, that's not the order I would have guessed it to pop up, and I think most of us would be really surprised to find that it was actually considerably cheaper to buy this product yesterday at Whole Foods than it was at any of the more mainstream grocery stores that you would expect to have lower prices. Next slide. So what do we do about all this? We know that it can be a barrier, so we want to help patients overcome this. The best advice is to shop around. The cost of these products changes weekly. A lot of times you can get really good deals by buying in bulk, by talking to your grocery store about when they're going to be having sales. We have lots of families that will buy cases of bread at a time because each loaf is $1.50 cheaper, and when you buy that over a case, that's a lot of money that they can end up saving. There are also support groups all over the country that will buy directly from manufacturers to get a lower cost deal for their support group members. So you can always encourage patients to look into these options. Next slide. So gluten is found in many medications. So the truth of the matter is that gluten is actually in very few medications and that the amount is very, very tiny. So just a few months ago, the FDA released new guidance on this topic because it's something that people have been asking about for a long time. The amount of gluten that's actually found in a pill is less than the amount of gluten that could potentially be found in a single serving of a cookie labeled as gluten-free. So this means that there's less than 20 parts per million in a pill. So what this really means is that if, for example, if a patient was taking an antibiotic for a very short period of time, there would probably be nothing to worry about. But when we do worry about this is when patients are taking maintenance drugs. There, of the 13 that we know of that contain gluten, some of them are blood pressure medication, there's a birth control pill, there's antibiotics. So for patients who are taking a maintenance drug multiple times a day for a long period of time, that's when you really want to check and make sure that they're taking a gluten-free version. And again, the easiest way to get this information is through glutenfreedrugs.com. This is maintained by the group of clinical pharmacists at Nationwide Children's, and they've just done a remarkable job of keeping the site updated and making a great resource for doctors and for patients. Next slide. So vaccines contain gluten. This is absolutely false. But it's something that has been coming up like hotcakes this year. There are no vaccines that contain gluten, and there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that vaccines are unsafe for people with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. The only thing to note here is that patients with celiac disease may react more weakly to the hepatitis B vaccine and therefore not become immune to it. So when you do have a patient newly diagnosed with celiac disease, it is important to check their immunity status. So where did this myth come from? A recent study from Columbia started investigating this after lots of people were suggesting that they weren't getting vaccines because they thought they contained gluten or that they were unsafe. So they surveyed 1,500 people with celiac disease or a gluten sensitivity, and 25% of the people with celiac and more than 40% with a gluten sensitivity said that they thought the vaccines were unsafe, and about 30% of them did not get a vaccine like the flu vaccine because they thought they contained gluten or that it was unsafe for them because of their celiac disease. So it's just something to be aware of. That's a rumor that goes through the gluten-free community, and just to make sure that we're always recommending to our patients that they get vaccinated, that vaccines are safe, and that there's no correlation between gluten and the vaccines. Next slide. So gluten-free oats aren't really gluten-free. So this is probably the most common question that we get in our clinic. So certified gluten-free oats are absolutely safe, but the problem is that many people with celiac disease will cross-react to the protein in oats. So they'll feel symptoms that are similar to what they would experience when eating gluten, but they're not actually reacting to gluten, they're reacting to the protein in oats. So what do we do with this information? So there are 3 types of oats. Generic oats, which are not certified gluten-free. These are oats that are grown in fields that are, like I talked about earlier, they're adjacent to wheat, rye, and barley fields, grown in the same fields at a different time of year, and there's no prevention of cross-contamination when they're harvested or transported or processed in facilities. These oats patients with celiac disease should not eat. Then there are 2 types that are safe for patients with celiac disease. There's purity protocol oats and mechanically sorted oats. And the biggest difference is in how these are grown. So oats that are grown under the purity protocol are grown in uncontaminated fields that have not had wheat, rye, or barley on them for at least 3 years. They're harvested using dedicated machinery and transported in vehicles that have been thoroughly cleaned and are safe and gluten-free. Then when they become processed, they're processed in a dedicated gluten-free facility and extensively tested to make sure that there was no contamination along the way. Mechanically sorted oats are what has been the real controversy in the gluten-free community. These are generic oats that are then mechanically sorted or optically sorted to remove the unwanted grains of wheat, rye, and barley, and then they're cleaned. They've been harvested and transported to a processing facility. So if we go to the next slide, this is the controversy that affected Cheerios. So you'll probably hear patients asking you about the Cheerios controversy and whether or not they're safe. So Cheerios does use a mechanical sorting process, and in October 2015, there was unfortunately a recall of them. It was a very, very small recall, and out of the billions of boxes of Cheerios that were produced, there were 43 complaints. What happened is that there was a disabled train, and they had to transfer the safe oats from a rail car to a tanker. And the tankers were not properly cleaned beforehand, and they had previously contained wheat flour. So this affected a very, very small selection of original Cheerios and Honey Nut Cheerios, and there was a recall on all of them. Since that happened, General Mills has implemented extremely rigorous testing, probably more rigorous than most manufacturers of other gluten-free products, to prevent errors that's happening at 3 different stages of production. And once the Cheerios are produced, 12 to 15 cartons from every single lot are pulled every 2 hours to test to ensure that they are actually gluten-free. So next slide. So here's what we recommend in our clinic for patients with celiac disease, that before we reintroduce oats into the diet, that they should be stably on the gluten-free diet, they should no longer be experiencing symptoms, and their TTG levels have normalized. Once all of those things happen, they should absolutely reintroduce gluten-free safe oats into their diet. And if they continue to experience symptoms, then we first of all need to confirm the gluten-free status of the oats that they're eating, and then remove oats from the diet again, stabilize, and reintroduce them with a different certified gluten-free product, just to make sure that they're actually reacting to the oats and not to something else. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about real news and resources that our celiac program has. So our program last year launched an app called the Celiac Disease and Gluten-Free Diet Digital Resource Center, and this is a free app that you can download in the Apple or Android marketplace. The app has all of our educational tools available for free. It has safe and unsafe ingredient lists, questionable lists, grocery shopping tips, about 100 different gluten-free recipes, many of which contain cooking videos to instruct you how to cook the recipe. We have a whole series of nutrition education videos that talk about different aspects of the gluten-free diet. We have a podcast that we produce twice a month that has different doctors, chefs, and just experts from all around the world talking about different elements of living with celiac disease and a gluten-free diet. We also have monthly classes and an events calendar where everything is posted. We have a blog with hot topics. We have continuing education seminars and just lots of really fun topics. This summer we're going to be launching a digital flashcard tool that will help patients learn about different things in the gluten-free diet, whether it's just understanding the safe ingredients better, making sure they really know which ingredients need to be looked at on food labels, or helping them when they dine in restaurants around the world. We'll have cards with translations in different languages so that people can travel and be safe while they're doing that and eating in restaurants. Next slide. This is a listing of all of our regularly scheduled nutrition education classes. Again, all of these are free. We have 2 at the Friendship Heights Whole Foods every month on the first Wednesday and the third Thursday of the month. And then in Northern Virginia at the Fairfax Whole Foods on the second Wednesday of the month. These are, again, all free, and we welcome all of your patients to attend. And then we also have a monthly webcast series with different hot topics in the gluten-free diet and celiac disease. And again, all of these are listed and can be registered through our app. So that is the end of our presentation.